I've looked via some satellite data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. You can see their logo in the bottom left-hand corner of these live satellite pictures. You can see a pretty clear night over the Golden State here as SpaceX is getting ready to launch its Falcon 9 rocket. So once we do get eyes on the vehicle coming up here in just a little bit, should be a pretty clear picture of the Falcon 9 rocket. Given the time of day as well and the clarity in the southwest part of the United States, should be some decent viewing not only for central to southern California, but also for the states to the east of California as well. So if you do happen to catch a glimpse of the Falcon 9 as it takes flight, be sure to tag us on X or Threads. Love to see the photos or videos you come up with from this launch. Talk about the countdown timeline and the milestones that have already passed by, what's still ahead as SpaceX prepares to launch its Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 9-11 mission in just a little more than 20 minutes. Following the go-ahead from the SpaceX launch director at roughly T-minus 38 minutes, prop load began with the loading of RP-1, or rocket-grade kerosene, on board the Falcon 9's first and second stages. At the same time, liquid oxygen began flowing on the Falcon 9's first stage. About T-minus 30 minutes is when they start loading cryogenic helium onto the pressure vessels on the Falcon 9's first stage. Helium is used to pressurize the main propellant tanks during flight. Same is true on the second stage, a handful of minutes later. T-minus 23 minutes is when second stage RP-1 loading wraps up, and then T-minus 20 minutes and 50 seconds is when the strong back chill down sequence begins. It's when they are thermally conditioning the feed lines prior to second stage LOX load. See that evidenced by the so-called big vent that comes up beginning at about T-minus 20 minutes and 20 seconds. And of course, second stage liquid oxygen load begins at T-minus 16 minutes. Moving right along, T-minus 7 minutes is when the chill down of the 9 Merlin engines gets underway. That chill down process involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbopumps. It helps protect the engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. About 6 minutes prior to liftoff, the first stage kerosene tank is full. And T-minus 4.5 minutes, we'll see the strong back retract sequence begin. Here at Vandenberg, the clamp arms open up underneath the payload fairings, and then the transporter erector, the strong back, will recline about 13 degrees away from the Falcon 9 rocket. It stays in that position until liftoff, at which point it'll pull back in a more rapid fashion to clear the way for the vertical climb of the Falcon 9. T-minus 3 minutes is when the first stage LOX tank is full. Same is true on the second stage about a minute or so later. At that point, the Falcon 9 is fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. In the final 60 seconds, as we hear the call that the Falcon 9 is in startup, control is handed over from the ground sequencer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computers. The propellant tanks are brought up to flight pressure. SpaceX launch director will give their go for launch at 45 seconds out. The engine ignition command is issued at T-minus 3 seconds. And if all 9 Merlin 1D engines are healthy and ignite, the flight computer will give the command for the hold-down clamps to release the Falcon 9 for a T0 liftoff. Coming up, T-minus 17 minutes, 37 seconds and counting. Or another word, try to be a man of my word. Falcon 9 rocket. It's going to be lifting off from that pad you just saw on this Google Earth view of Vandenberg Space Force Base and, broadly speaking, California. They'll be flying in a southeasterly trajectory with the first stage booster following that orange arc that you see there on the screen. The booster will be touching down on the drone ship. Of course, I Still Love You. Currently the only SpaceX drone ship that is positioned here on the West Coast. If successful with this booster landing, it'll mark the 108th time a booster has successfully landed on the drone ship, of course, I Still Love You, and the 367th booster landing for SpaceX to date. First stage booster flying this mission, tail number B1082, is preparing to make its 8th flight to space and back. SpaceX will also endeavor to recover the payload fairings at the top of Falcon 9 stack. They gently splash down into the waters of the Pacific Ocean under the support of parachutes, as you see in this image here from a SpaceX presentation from earlier this year. They'll be recovered by one of SpaceX's recovery vessels. I believe Go Beyond is on deck to support this mission today. SpaceX is in the process of certifying both its payload fairings as well as its first stage boosters for up to 40 flights apiece. Recently, they just notched their first 23rd booster landing by a single booster. That was the flight of B1067, which launched just earlier this week, in fact, on Monday. Talk about B1082 getting ready to make its 8th flight in now about 13 minutes. First took off on January 3rd of this year, launching the Starlink 7-9 mission. That was followed up on February 15th by Starlink 7-14. Mission for the U.S. Space Force was on deck next. This was USSF 62, otherwise known as WSF-M number 1, acronym standing for the Weather System Follow-on Microwave, part of an environmental satellite system for the Department of Defense. After that, this booster launched a series of Starlink missions. We had Starlink 8-2 on May 10th, 9-1 on June 19th, and then 11-1 on August 4th. That was followed up by the 20th and final batch of OneWeb Generation 1 satellites. 20 were on board that Falcon flight, which lifted off on October 20th. Today, with this particular batch of Starlink satellites, of course, we've got the 20 that are on board, and among those are 13 that feature direct-to-cell capabilities. According to Ben Longmire, a senior director of satellite engineering for SpaceX, prior to this launch happening, there were, I believe he said, 4 more launches of the direct-to-cell capability to finish fleshing out this part of the Starlink constellation before they start bringing that capability out to a customer base. So getting very close to reaching that threshold, given they still have at least a couple dozen more launches on the manifest for this year. Guessing they'll probably notch that before the year is done. Each of these Starlink V2 mini satellites clock in at about 1,760 pounds, or about 800 kilograms. With their solar panels unfurled, they have a wingspan of about 100 feet or 30 meters. They use argon Hall thrusters for in-orbit maneuvering, as opposed to the previously used Krypton Hall thrusters. They were built in Redmond, Washington, which is near Seattle. They'll be deployed at about 183 miles or 295 kilometers in altitude at a 53-degree inclination. Also want to note we're T-minus 6 minutes, 50 seconds and counting. At this point, the chill down of the 9 Merlin 1D engines will now have gotten underway. Thanks to HEO Robotics and Black Sky, we do have an actual picture of a Starlink V2 mini satellite in its on-orbit configuration. HEO specializes in imagery of objects around the Earth, not specifically of the Earth itself. So appreciate them in sharing this image of a Starlink V2 mini satellite to the general public. As we're looking towards liftoff in just a little under 6 minutes from now, let's go ahead and talk about the launch timeline as we're anticipating it. Of course, the Falcon 9 lifting off in less than 6 minutes now. After that point, it'll pass through max Q, or the point of greatest aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle, about 1:07 into the flight. That'll be followed by a few different events in fairly rapid succession. We'll see first stage managed cutoff, or MECO, at T plus 2 minutes and 25 seconds, followed a few seconds after that by stage separation. Marlin vacuum engine will ignite 2 minutes 35 seconds into flight. Payload fairings will be jettisoned just after the 3-minute mark. First stage entry burn, slowing down the first stage booster, take about 24 seconds beginning just after the 6-minute point. Setting up for the landing burn to begin at T plus 7 minutes and 44 seconds. The first stage drone ship landing expected at 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Second stage engine will cut off at T plus 8 minutes 37 seconds. There'll be a brief 1-second burn of the upper stage engine at T plus 53 minutes and 17 seconds, setting up for Starlink satellites to be deployed at 1 hour and 10 seconds after liftoff. And with that, bring you
retract has started.
Views and sounds of the Falcon 9 rocket. And as you can see, it is a wonderfully clear night here at Vandenberg, as we showed you those satellite images earlier. And the strong back retract now getting underway. As you can see, the clamp arms underneath the payload fairings opening up. Shortly see the transporter erector. There we go, on the move. Pulls back about 13 degrees away from the Falcon 9 rocket here.
Stage 1 lock load is complete.
A good call there from SpaceX. Now just waiting on second stage lock load to wrap up, and then we'll have a fully fueled rocket. Want to thank Space Pony for being a channel member with us now for 28 months at the mission specialist level. Really appreciate your ongoing support, Space Pony, who says, "Let's go SpaceX, let's go Starlink."
Stage 2 lock load is complete.
And with that call, the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. They're now purging the remaining liquid oxygen from the feed lines prior to liftoff coming up in just a little bit more than a minute now.
Falcon9 isn't started up.
And with that, we are now awaiting the SpaceX launch director to give their go for launch in just a few seconds.
LD is go for launch.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and step back and watch the ascent of the Falcon 9 rocket. We'll be back on the other side of liftoff with some additional commentary.
T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. And lift off Falcon 9. Go Starlink, go SpaceX.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
Power and telemetry are nominal.
Falcon 9 is supersonic. Max Q.
And with a good liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket, this mission is off to a solid start after departing from Vandenberg Space Force Base, now a minute and a half into the mission.
MVAC chill.
As you just heard, they're thermally conditioning the Merlin vacuum engine on the Falcon 9's second stage prior to its ignition. So here's the order of things as they're about to come up. See first stage main engine cutoff for MECO in roughly 2 minutes 25 seconds after liftoff. That'll be followed by stage separation, the ignition of that Merlin vacuum engine, and then the payload fairings will be deployed at just past the 3-minute mark.
Main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
MVAC ignition.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And those Starlink satellites now exposed to the vacuum of space for the first time on this mission. Now T plus 3 minutes, 25 seconds and counting into flight. So far all going smoothly with this Falcon 9 mission.
Both vehicles are following nominal trajectories.
As confirmed by mission control. The next milestone we're looking for is the start of the first stage entry burn. It's coming up at T plus 6 minutes and 4 seconds. That burn should last about 24 seconds in total. Watching the first stage telemetry data, you can see that the booster has reached its apogee and has started to make its descent towards the drone ship called Of Course I Still Love You, which is positioned out in the Pacific Ocean, awaiting this booster to land for an 8th time. Taking a look up through the inner stage on the left-hand side of your screen, toggling back and forth between two different camera views on the Falcon 9's second stage, allowing continuous views of both halves of the Merlin vacuum engine, ensuring there's a good, even burn. Of course, this visual camera data just one point in charting the flight of this Falcon 9 rocket, where SpaceX has their eyes on a whole lot more data at their headquarters in Hawthorne, California. Now 6 minutes into flight.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
With this entry burn, you can see the speedometer dropping quite rapidly now on the Falcon 9's first stage, as the booster is using 3 of the Merlin engines to brake.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And a good conclusion of that entry burn. Now 6 minutes 41 seconds into flight. We're just about a minute away now
Both
from
vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
the start of
Stage
the
1 FTS is saved.
first stage landing burn. That last call, the FTS in the first stage being safed, that's the flight termination system, now no longer needed at this stage in the mission.
Stage 1 transonic.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Landing burn should be starting momentarily.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 2 terminal guidance.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
MVAC shut down.
Nominal orbit insertion.
Out of our mission stats, they currently stand with a good liftoff and landing of the first stage booster for this Starlink mission, 9-11. That marked the 8th flight of Falcon 9 booster B1081 in the SpaceX fleet. Brief typo, that was booster 1082, not 1081. Nevertheless, it marked the 394th Falcon 9 launch to date. Was the 109th Falcon 9 launch of 2024. The 339th Falcon booster reflight, or the launch of a booster that has flown at least once. This was the 111th SpaceX orbital launch of 2024, including 2 Falcon Heavy launches. This is SpaceX's 124th orbital launch within the last 365 days. The 98th orbital launch from Space Launch Complex 4 East, and the 166th overall orbital launch from this pad. Moving on to some recovery stats. This was the 108th booster landing on the drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. That marked the 288th drone ship landing and the 367th Falcon booster landing for SpaceX so far. Finally, with some industry stats, this marked the 39th orbital launch from California this year, the 118th orbital launch from U.S. soil, the 129th launch from a U.S. rocket company, and the 212th orbital launch from around the globe. 6 launch failures on the year so far. Here's where the pie chart currently stands. Of course, the U.S. number getting ready to notch up by 1 more in just a handful of hours. So, once again, we are making preparations for the launch of Starlink 6-68 from Pad 40 here in Florida.